Hey there, everyone. Mychal Bryan here from the Oraculos podcast, and I am very happy to be sitting here with someone who is very special to me and also very special to our Oraculos family, Mr. Jack Kovaleski. Hey, Jack.
Hi, Michael.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Awesome. I'm doing super good. So, for those of you who don't know, Jack is one of our senior students at the Oraculo School of Astrology. And Jack and I were here right now to talk about Mastering Traditional Astrology, my book, which is technically supposed to be coming out on the 7th of April. And since that's clearly not happening, I figured that it would be great for us to release something somewhat promotional on the 7th of April. So Jack is going to be asking me a couple questions and hopefully we dive into talking about what the book is about.
I'm so excited. I can't wait to talk about it.
Me too. Me too. I mean, it's
And I
been,
can't wait to read. I can't wait to hold it in my hands.
well, hold on. Let me show you what is going on. So I technically, I promised people the other day that after I publish these books, I become one of those writing people who make YouTube videos about writing. And I'm so serious about that because it's been such a process. So I'm holding in my hands right now two copies of the book. This one is from Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing, or KDP. And this one is from Ingram Spark, who is actually who I'm going to go with at the end of the day in terms of publishing the book. But they're very thick. It's
They're full
really,
of knowledge.
yeah, I mean, it's like my entire brain on paper. I'm super excited about it.
Well, let's just start at the very beginning. Where did you grow up, and how did your bringing bring you to astrology? How did your spiritual background bring you to astrology? And how does the sort of like soup of your childhood kind of like meld into the delicious stew that is now your beautiful astrology practice?
Awesome. Well, wow. I've never heard my childhood described so sexily. Anyway, so
I don't know where that came from, but okay, go with it.
well, I wrote about this actually, so I'll read you the very first paragraph of the acknowledgement in the book because I actually wrote about this. So I wrote, I became a student of astrology, tarot, magic, and Jewish mysticism at a very young age. I grew up deeply embedded in an Orthodox Christian environment. My parents, grandparents, and their parents had all been Seventh-day Adventists. No one wore jewelry and women only wore skirts. The outside world ceased to exist on Friday evening. The movie theater was the invention of the devil himself, and heaven forbid anyone should drink a Coca-Cola or even harbor a secret craving for anything remotely caffeinated. I went to an Adventist preschool, primary school, high school, and university. Every facet of my education was heavily Bible-based, which means that every step of the way I got in trouble for my strange interests. So, while this is not like my autobiography or anything, I felt it was really important for me to give people some context for just, like you said, where did this entire thing originate? And it really came out of left field because nothing about my environment or my childhood or my upbringing even had the range to really hold the sort of experiences I was interested in, or to even create space for me being a Black, gay, artistically inclined, astrological, tarot loving teenager and child. And so I really don't know, Jack, to go back to your question, I really don't know where all of this came from for me. But when it started, it really took everything over. And I think at a very early age, I knew that I wanted to be a part of something magical. And I also think that a lot of young queer children have that experience of wanting to get away or wanting to run away from the realities of their lives. And at a young age, I think I started to read Anne Rice, and she really was my template for what it meant to live this parallel life of being one thing on one level, but having this deep and this mysterious and this beautiful life underneath the surface. And so I started reading her books, and then Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling became or came into my orbit not too long after that. So I started to read Harry Potter. And as whimsical as these points of quote unquote mystical contact may seem, they really served as a template for me to have that sort of escape experience and to have that sort of not just being bound within a very biblical environment, but to give me something else that was truly magical or that made my childhood feel a little bit more magical for me to dive into. So I think that between reading Blood and Gold by Anne Rice and reading Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling and really, or rather J.K. Rowling, and really having these people create these worlds of magic, I was like, hey, I want to be a part of that. Like, I genuinely want to find a means of cultivating that for myself. And I waited for a very long time for my Hogwarts letter that never came. And so I would go to sleep at night and have these dreams of being in a magical school. And I would have these dreams of just being in a very magical space. And so I sought out ways for me to create magic in my life in a way that was real and in a way that was tangible. And I quickly realized that there was no magic wand that I'd wave, and there was no spell that I'd cast that would make somebody turn into a horse or whatever. But I did start to find these very ancient practices that, while they weren't that fantastical, they still carried a great level of magic and mysticism within them. And tarot was one of them, and astrology definitely was one of them, and the runes and geomancy and chiromancy, all of these ancient practices started to come into my life. And from there, it just mushroomed out into who I've become today.
That makes a lot of sense when you start to read the book, because you draw from the Kabbalah, you draw from Hermetic philosophy. Can you talk about how those things tie into traditional astrology and why they're important to put together into a book like this?
One of the things I have always found, especially in the astrological community, was that there really isn't, to my knowledge, and caveat, I do tend to live in a very isolative world. I created the Oraculos School of Astrology to specifically be my tiny bubble, so I'm not really aware of what's going on elsewhere within the astrological community overwhelmingly. But one of the things that I did get a real sensitivity about, particularly because I speak at a lot of conferences, and some of the questions that people ask me at conferences, or some of the questions that people ask me when I create open forums for other astrologers to come into Oraculos and either see how we practice or to have their questions answered by me. One of the things that I realize is that people, one, tend to have a lot of the same questions. And two, a lot of those questions really echo this resounding yearning within them to really understand the reason why behind a lot of the things that we practice and do from an astrological perspective. And even though we are living in this period where there's such a massive traditional astrology renaissance going on, no pun intended, but there is this large traditional astrology rebirth going on, and so many people want to be into traditional astrology. And everywhere you turn, you hear people saying that they're doing Hellenistic astrology or that they do Horary astrology or whatever. So there's such a big urge for people to go back to their roots. But even then, I find that with that urge and with them returning to these ancient astrological traditions, they still haven't found the reason why behind astrology. And that's always been a very important thing for me. I think that that has guided so much of my development as an artist. When I was younger, I went to dance school in Cuba. And one of the things that was really important to me while being there was to find out the roots of the Cuban modern dance technique, because it's such a beautiful thing and it really encapsulates the culture of that country so well. I wanted to understand every single detail about it. And I wanted to understand, why do we warm up in this way? And why do we progress a class in this way? And why? That's always been such a deep part of my own modus operandi and how I move through the world. And so basically, when it comes to this book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, I wanted to answer that why question about so many parts of traditional astrology and the structure of traditional astrology for people, because I found that those answers weren't lacking. When we look at ancient traditional astrology texts, we see ancient authors dedicating so much time to speak about why do we consider Saturn a malefic, for example, or why do we consider Jupiter a benefic? What is it about them? It's not just because Jupiter represents expansion, and it's not just because Saturn represents restriction. Where do we get those concepts from? At the very core of our astrological understanding. And those answers exist. And as we read ancient texts thoroughly, we find that those answers have been provided by just about as many people who have written those texts. And so I wanted to bring them to the 21st century, bring those answers to the 21st century, as well as share my own thoughts on their answers from my modern 21st century perspective, which I think is also something that tends to be lacking in traditional astrology, because we find a lot of people who can quote traditional astrology authors verbatim, but they don't have a means of actually rooting that understanding in a modern context. And I definitely wanted to do that for my readers. It's something that I routinely do for my students at the Oraculos School of Astrology. And I wanted to capture the classroom experience in this book.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. I think it also speaks to your first answer about how your childhood sort of like led you to explore the Western mystery tradition. And so these things are not isolated, they're actually part of a tradition that expands beyond astrology. And I really like that part of the book, that it's bringing in these other perspectives and traditions that all have a symbolic language that gets interwoven into something that's bigger than just astrology.
Yeah. And I think one of the things for me has always been that astrology, I mean, you have to really be dedicated to astrology to want to become an astrologer, because it's really a dense subject. And I think that astrology has an air of superiority surrounding it, because I've said to people often that tarot is the poor man's oracle. You know, anybody can pick up a pack of tarot cards and think that they're a tarot reader, because there is something about tarot that just naturally lends itself to a certain level of interpretation, even if you don't really dive into the symbolic structure of the tarot and where that comes from within the Western mystery tradition. If you pick up a pack of tarot cards and they all have an image on them, chances are your lived experience can project onto those cards what you think they mean. Whereas if you look at a black and white astrology chart, like there's nothing within that that lends that same level of interpretational readiness, or that lends that level of interpretational eagerness. You literally have to be an astrologer to understand how to interpret the chart. So on the one hand, we have this narrative, or I have this narrative of astrology being really the hoi polloi sort of thing that the bourgeoisie do because we have a lot of time and we have a lot of energy and we are willing to go that extra mile to learn it. But even within that, I really wanted to give people who wanted to dedicate that time to learning astrology something else to sink their teeth into that wasn't just a technicality of astrology. I mean, how many times can you teach somebody about a square or a sextile? I wanted to really give people something that allowed them to feel like they were participating in a magical tradition, because they are participating in a magical tradition. The entire Western mystery tradition is emphatically astrological. It is built on this notion of astrology being the undercurrent of all of the world's religions, and also of astrology being the undercurrent of all of the world's magical practices. So if astrology is this undercurrent, how can we bring more of that spirit of spirituality and I dare say even religiosity, and also this sense of being connected to something deeper. How could we bring something else to life within people as they study astrology so that they feel more fulfilled from that study, as opposed to feeling like they're jamming disparate pieces into their mind that don't actually come together in a cohesive way that leaves them feeling enriched.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that's part of what we learn at Oraculos is how to translate this kind of static black and white symbols into something that is actually lived in, that the astrology becomes something that is reflective of the world that we all live in, because that's what astrology is. It's not just symbols, it is the universe.
That's been my intention, and I'm really happy to have done this. And I think that people who have read it thus far, they feel a sense of really enjoying what it does for them. And it's refreshing to be able to pick up a beginner's astrology book, because that's what it is. It's also a book for raw beginners. It's not meant to be a book for my colleagues with their PhDs. It's meant to be a book for raw beginners who are wanting to enter astrology, who've probably felt intimidated by the subject of astrology before because it's been too technical. And admittedly, astrology is still a technical field, but I wanted to translate on paper what we do in the classroom so that as people read this book, they feel held. And while it does give them a lot of information, that's why I call it a depth of beginning. So there is this rich depth of information that they dive into. I still try to do it in a way that isn't careless and in a way that isn't reckless, so that it seems systemically built on every other piece. So each chapter should feel like it was intelligently placed and intelligently designed to be a bridge between the chapter that came before it and the chapter that comes after it.
Can you talk a little bit about the choices that you made to actually design a book that you could just pick up and read front to back if you are kind of a newcomer to astrology, and also something that someone could use as a textbook, and how those things kind of work together to create something that's readable yet practical, sometimes poetic, sometimes very pragmatic? Can you talk about that interplay?
Yeah, I went to school to be a journalist, and I love writing. I mean, that's just something that I've always enjoyed doing. And I love the process of guiding someone through a journey through writing. And so I knew that I wanted to create a technical textbook because I'm also a very technical person. And I consider myself not just to be an astrological practitioner, but also an astrological technician. I'm very keenly aware of the level of technical skill and proficiency that is required to read a birth chart well, or to read any chart well for that matter. So I knew I wanted to create a technical textbook. And at the same time, I also wanted to create something that could be read as prose, or something that could be read in a way that made you feel as if you were reading a novel or a story almost, or something that you wanted to read because it pulled you forward. And very often technical textbooks don't have that ability to pull someone forward. People tend to go directly to the chapter that they're interested in order to get the information they're looking for, and then they put the textbook down until they have another need that they find answered or addressed in yet another chapter. And I didn't really want people to have that very broken relationship to reading the book. So I tried to write it in a way that would encourage people to read it cover to cover. I mean, in essence, the book is about 587 pages of written content to be read. So it's no small feat. But at the same time, I wanted for people to have an experience of having very technical moments that allowed them to become crystal clear on something I was trying to express, but I also wanted for them to enjoy the process of reading so that it felt like something that you wanted to read after a long day of work. And so it didn't feel like something that felt like an additional burden. And so, I mean, that's really what my thought process was in the process of writing this book. I'm okay with how it came out. I think that there's a part of me that's really, I'm an uber perfectionist. So I have worried about, have I tried to simplify this content to the point of it reading like C spot run or, Jack likes ball or whatever. So I've wondered whether or not I've oversimplified it, because I definitely have wanted to create a simple book, because I think that there are so many astrological books in the world right now that really do no service to anyone. I think that as astrologers, we oftentimes get caught up in this internal narrative of trying to not sound stupid to our colleagues, that we want to write books that are historically sound, and we want to write books that reference every period of astrological transmission throughout history, and we want to write books that document that transmission, to the point where we lose the actual magic of astrology. And I didn't want to write a non-magical book. I didn't want to write a non-dimensional book. I wanted to write a book that felt like a prayer. And I also wanted to write a book that felt like it gave people something that they wanted to belong to. Because once again, going back to my story as a Black queer kid growing up in the Bible Belt of the Caribbean, I deeply wanted a community or something magical to belong to. So I really hope that people feel that way when they read this book, especially beginners. I have to continuously reinforce that Oraculos, as a school, we are a school for raw beginner astrologers who are wanting to become full-fledged professional astrologers. And this first book in the Oraculos Complete Astrology series is meant for beginners, and it's meant to give beginners a feeling of belonging in astrology. So even though I know everybody who buys this book isn't going to be a beginner, and some people who buy this book, they might be like, wow, I just spent $29.99 on this book and I know all of this stuff already. It really is a book that's meant to allow people who already practice astrology to deepen their understanding of the elements of astrology and where those things come from traditionally. But more importantly, it's meant to give beginners a depth of beginning so that they can feel as if from that beginning, they can sequentially build an astrological practice for themselves that they feel confident about and that they also can rely on.
And that sort of sparks my next question, which is, can you talk about the phrase "a depth of beginning" and why you chose that as part of your title for this book?
That phrase, "a depth of beginning." So, as you know, I am a Hebrew calligrapher. A big part of my life has been dedicated to studying the Hebrew alphabet. I won't even say the Hebrew language, that kind of came later, but because of my studies of the Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic Tarot, I have always been in love with the Hebrew alphabet and with Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah specifically. And in one of the ancient Kabbalistic texts, the Sefer Yetzirah, which means the Book of Formation, it describes how Elohim, or how God, basically created the entire universe. In the first few chapters of that book, there's one section where it said that God created the entire universe and he gave it a depth of height and a depth of low, a depth of north and a depth of south, a depth of beginning and a depth of ending, a depth of center and a depth of breadth. And it just goes on and it speaks about the endlessness and the majesty of the universe and how this universe was created to be everlasting and how this universe was created in the shape of infinity. So I've always really enjoyed this notion of a depth of beginning and knowing that you can start something, but you can start something profoundly, and you can start something in such a profound way that it sets you up for the rest of your entire life in that practice. So this book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, A Depth of Beginning in the Celestial Art, is meant to give people a profound beginning in astrology. Once again, emphasizing this is a book for raw beginner students of astrology who don't know the difference between an equator and a flying meatball. So this book is really meant to give that type of student a rich foundational understanding that makes them feel like even if they choose not to read anything else I write from here on out, at least based on this first book, they feel as if they can interact with any field of astrology that they feel drawn to.
Right. So we're talking about the first book in hopefully a very long series. Where does this book begin and end? What does it include and what does it not include?
That's a very great question, Jack. And I have done my best within my astrological teaching career and also in my fresh career as an astrological author to pull out of astrology like, who am I? But I've done my best to pull out of the astrology that I teach all the things that I don't find absolutely necessary. Astrology is a phenomenal subject. It's also an everlasting subject. You can study astrology forever and then discover that they just found a lost manuscript of some guy from 2,000 years ago by the name of Booga Booga. And so you have not yet read Booga Booga's manuscript, and you'll then realize that Booga Booga has a whole new type of astrology that you still haven't understood yet. So the point is that astrology is endless, and at the rate at which we're going within the astrological community, we're very likely to discover more things from our astrological past because more and more people are equipping themselves with the tools necessary to retrieve those gems from our past. However, for me, everything that we find within traditional astrology textbooks isn't necessary. And so pragmatism is really one of the most fundamental things for me as a human being. I needed to make sense. I needed to make sense in a way that can naturally translate into a usable skill. So I've tried my hardest to write a book that only incorporates the things that I find necessary for myself to know within my practice of astrology, but also things that I find necessary for my students to know within their practice of astrology. I've left out quite a bit. And the things that I've left out, for me personally, don't allow students to become better astrologers, or they don't allow students to be better astrologers. There's this notion within traditional astrology that some signs of the zodiac are winged and other signs of the zodiac are maimed, and some signs of the zodiac are equinoctial, and some signs of the zodiac are tropical, and some signs of the zodiac are this and that. And that, I mean, besides the fact that I tend not to be a very heavily zodiac oriented astrologer in general, I also didn't find a lot of that necessary to replicate within my work because I've never spoken to someone about the fact that them having Virgo rising on the cusp of their ascendant makes them blah blah because Virgo is a winged sign. And so I've never really found the need to do a lot of the things we find in traditional astrology textbooks, and my astrology doesn't suffer because of it. I practice concrete event-based astrology. I have a high batting average as far as accuracy is concerned. And granted, I'm not accurate 100% of the time. No astrologer is accurate 100% of the time, but I tend to be accurate when I read charts more often than not. And I tend to be accurate about concrete events that have occurred within people's lives. And that is my particular orientation to astrology. And if I were burdened with every single floating piece of transiting gravel that exists within the larger astrological universe, I wouldn't be able to practice astrology with the level of clarity and the level of precision that I do. So I don't want people to get paralyzed by having too much information. And I also don't want people to feel stunted by feeling as if they have to memorize a lot of unnecessary information. So the only things that are in this book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, are things that I feel are absolutely vital for people to know in their practice of concrete event-based astrology.
Yeah, and I will say that, when I came to you, I guess two years ago, 2.5 years ago, I don't know. I was a beginner. I had been, dabbling a little bit, but I didn't have a container for all of the enormous amount of information that exists in the astrological community. And that's the thing that really drew me to the school, the Oraculos school, is that, now I have this structure to my understanding of astrology that it gets filled in more and more every time I practice. But I have a very detailed and robust scaffolding upon which I can grow my own practice. And so I do think that that's reflected in this book as well.
Yeah. And to your point, Jack, I think that a part of what we do at Oraculos is that we have a very rigorous traditional astrology basis, but we also integrate Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto within our astrology because we have found value within those modern planets. And we integrate them in a very narrow way. We integrate them and we give them a very clear boundary for how to operate or how they can operate. We know that they don't rule signs of the zodiac. We know that essential dignity and ability as a topic doesn't apply to them. There are so many ways how we contain our use of non-traditional things within our astrology, but we use them all the same. What I heard reflected in what you just said was that there is a clarity of thought that you have in terms of what you practice and in terms of how you organize the different components of your practice. And I think that that's one of the things that we do at the Oraculos School of Astrology very well. We say, hey, here's what traditional astrology looks like. Here's what non-traditional astrology looks like. When you're practicing your astrology, if you're going to use the two of them, you should know the context within which you use one versus another. And I've tried to take that thread of clarity that we provide at the Oraculos School of Astrology, and it is emphatically everywhere throughout this book. One of the people who wrote something that wasn't all that amazing in terms of a book review said that one of the things that he didn't appreciate about the text was that there were places where I was really quoting specifically from the ancients, and there were other places where I was expanding or elaborating based on my own understanding. And I literally say that. Like I say that at the beginning of the book. I say that I teaching what the ancients taught, but I'm also, as a mode of realizing that we don't fossilize as human beings, we also grow and expand as human beings. I'm also continuing from there, not as a means of reinventing the wheel, but as a means of bringing something within more of a 21st century context. And so I appreciate that a lot about this book because I know that that's represented in what my efforts have been in trying to write it. But I also appreciate that when I hear you speaking about your own experience of astrology, because that thread follows through the people who get trained at Oraculos, through the sort of books we create at Oraculos, this sense of really understanding what we practice, why we practice it, how we practice it, what the limitations are surrounding how we practice it, but also giving us a sense of openness to be able to do other things as a result of that strong and clear foundation.
Yeah, exactly. And it also speaks to the idea that, we can't practice astrology in the way that the ancients practiced it. We have to practice it in a way that is reflective of our experiences in 2023, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why I have never been a candidate for president of the Traditional Astrology Association of the world is because I don't think it's necessary to try to replicate the astrology that was practiced in the 1300s or in 900 CE or anything to that effect. I am so grateful for the work that they did, but we live in the year 2023. And as I hear a lot of traditional astrologers speaking, I grieve a little bit when I see people who are brilliant people, but who want to replicate astrology from a period of time that we no longer exist in. And not only replicate that astrology, but also not advance that astrology towards futurity. And the astrologers of their day were also advancing their astrology towards futurity. While I know that Jean-Baptiste Morin isn't the most ancient astrologer in the world, he lived in the 17th century, he still represented a pioneer in astrology who held on to traditional astrological concepts and advance them to fit the ever-growing demands of his own desire to be an astrologer practicing within his own modern day. So when I see some of my own colleagues practicing in a way that doesn't have that orientation towards the future attached to what they do, it kind of saddens me a bit because, I mean, the world is so big and our humanity is so big, and traditional astrology is a wonderful template for exploring that humanity, but we also have to contribute something to it if this astrology is going to be reflective of where we are now within the 21st century.
So this brings me to another question, which is you work within two very distinct schools of astrology. One is Renaissance astrology as a tradition. One is Uranian astrology. What is it about these two periods that resonate with you, and what makes them distinct while also being different astrologies that can work together in one practice?
This is a great question, Jack. And I think a part of why this is great is because the two schools of astrology that you just identified are schools of astrology that are fundamentally based on this notion of concrete event-based astrology. And one of the reasons why I say that we teach concrete event-based astrology at Oraculos is because that is the underlying motif of both traditional astrology in general, but also of what we call Uranian astrology. And so I love traditional astrology because it's very pragmatic. When we read some of the nativities or the birth charts that were cast by ancient astrologers or even more contemporary 17th century astrologers, there's this certain pragmatism. There isn't this over gushing for pages and pages about your personality. There's really this pragmatism of this person is going to have 3 siblings. They're all going to be men. One of them is going to die from a dog bite. And this person's father is going to be no good. And this person is going to have no children. And this person is going to live happily and have a happy, harmonious marriage. And this person is going to travel the world. And it's a very pragmatic approach to astrology. And we don't find any of the, I don't want to say the fluffiness, but we don't find the wastage of words and space that I think tends to happen in a lot of non-traditional astrology. And granted, I find a lot of value in people who practice modern astrology. Some of the people who I look up to in terms of being great astrologers are people who are very, very modern astrologers, but they don't commit themselves to only practicing a psychological or quote unquote spiritual type of astrology. They're modern astrologers who commit themselves to practicing astrology in a concrete event-based way. So I love traditional astrology for that reason, because everywhere within traditional astrology, it's really dedicated to concrete event-based astrology. And I also love Uranian astrology for that same reason. It was created to be an astrology to predict events. It is emphatically predictive. And if you're going to practice predictive astrology, you're also kind of already practicing concrete event-based astrology. So it's for that reason why I think that both of them work well together. Uranian astrology is also based on some very ancient astrological principles as well. And I think that the way that it gets presented in the 21st century is a way that has no ability to acknowledge some of those ancient astrological principles. I mean, one of the primary principles that Uranian astrology is built on is this notion of antisha and contra-antisha. That is the very heart of Uranian astrology. And we know that antisha refers to reflection points on either side of the Cancer-Capricorn axis. And basically, the founder of Uranian astrology said, well, hey, if we could do that with the Cancer Capricorn axis, why can't we make a planet be an axis of reflection? So if I could have 0 degrees Cancer be an axis of reflection, why can't I make this person's Venus also be an axis of reflection with planets equally on either side of her? Why can't I make this person's Mercury be an axis of reflection with planets equally on either side of him? So what we find in Uranian astrology very often is this understanding of traditional astrology and this reframing of traditional astrology in a way that gives it more latitude and gives it more room for experimentation. Fine, there are some things about Uranian astrology that are definitely not traditional, such as the trans-Neptunian planets of Alfred Witte. And I think for that reason, when I introduce Uranian astrology to my students, I tend to do so without introducing Alfred Witte's concept of the trans-Neptunian planets at all, because the system works well without them. And the system of Uranian astrology is highly Ptolemaic as far as astrology is concerned. Claudius Ptolemy was one of the major proponents of this notion of planets as universal significators. So the sun could be your physical body, but it could also be your boss and your dad and your granddad and your king and your all of these things. The moon could be a mother, but the moon could also be your sisters and your female servants and the queen and the voice of the people and all of this stuff. So Claudius Ptolemy was really one of the major proponents of this notion of planets as universal significators. And while you could only throw that so far, there is a lot of universal signification that works. The moon, for the most part, seems to work well as a universal significator of the family and the mother. Venus, for the most part, seems to work well as a universal significator of our love language and our relationship to love and romance in general. So Uranian astrology basically uses that notion of universal significators and expands it and creates an entire system of astrology based on that. So I love it because I can find the essence of Uranian astrology in one of the most ancient styles of Western tropical astrology. And so for me, there is no major clear dividing line between what is traditional and what really is Uranian, because the two things blend well together within my personal practice. However, in this book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, I really try to stay faithful to people having an exploration of traditional astrology as its own subject. But because I'm very mercurial and I believe in planting tiny seeds of chaos everywhere, I have planted seeds and I have let people know, hey, a lot of the things that we see within this traditional astrology, we also see this being rehashed within Uranian astrology in the 20th century and the offshoot of Uranian astrology, cosmobiology. So let's just keep our mind open when we revisit those topics later in another publication.
Yeah, and that answer is really a depth of beginning, right? It gives somebody kind of like a doorway that's into this whole kingdom that they are about to walk into with this book.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, this book is really meant to prime people for understanding traditional astrology well. But my end goal is to teach people how to practice concrete event-based astrology well. And so while this first book is called Mastering Traditional Astrology, which I know some people already hate it for because One, I speak about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and I know that people are having a really hard time with that. And there are other things that truthfully, I think that that's my one major crime against humanity, the fact that I have a section for Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in the book. But ultimately, at the end of the day, while this book will give people a wonderful basis in traditional Western tropical astrology with an emphasis on the astrology of the 17th century as well as the medieval period, my intention or my long-term goal is to create a series of books that allows people to practice concrete, event-based astrology well. And there are some things that I will introduce in future publications that aren't necessarily found within traditional Western astrology as we currently think about it. There are things that I do that I find great value in. For example, I use the semi-squares and the sesquiquadrates routinely within my natal astrology practice because I find great value within those aspects as aspects of manifestation. Semi-squares and sesquiquadrates routinely, systemically represent concrete real-world events that occur within people's lives, and I don't leave home without them within the context of my natal practice. I don't use them in traditional horary astrology because I haven't really found any sphere of horary astrology where a semi-square or a sesquiquadrate is a necessary thing to bring into horary practice. So I don't use them there at all. However, I do find them to be very valuable within natal astrology. Similarly, declination. I don't use parallels and contraparallels truly within traditional horary astrology practice. I haven't really found any sphere within traditional horary astrology practice where parallels and contraparallels need to be mentioned at all. However, I use them routinely within my natal astrology practice. I don't use quincunxes within horary astrology practice, but I use them routinely within my natal astrology practice. So as I continue to write books, I hope to give people this ability to clarify their relationship to what to use and where, because I think that that's also a thing that people get very confused about. They know that within traditional astrology, we have all of these tools, but they don't know where those tools are most beneficial. Essential dignity is another thing. Highly beneficial within electional astrology, highly beneficial within horary astrology, within natal astrology. For me personally, as a person who practices astrology that is concrete, event-based, and that has a very high track record for accuracy, I don't necessarily find lesser levels of essential dignity to be very vital within natal astrology. I genuinely don't find that to be the case. And I have a very high batting average of accuracy. So I think that I do have some skin in the game as far as being an authoritative voice in terms of how far we can take that technique. However, I find it immensely useful within horary astrology. So there are things that I have come to within the context of my own practice that definitely can fit all within one book. This book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, isn't meant to be the place where I fit everything in, but it's meant to be a starting point so that as we continue to go down this path together, we can see how and where to use the various skills and techniques that I'll be sharing with people within future publications.
Can you open the book a little bit and just sort of show us the layout and why you've chosen, some of the symbols that you've chosen? What's the cover design, and how is it all very intentional?
Within traditional Western alchemy, there's this notion of sulfur being one of the three vital qualities or principles or substances that exists within the universe. And sulfur is represented by the color red, and that sulfur is meant to represent a burning desire within everything to be and become what it will be. And it's meant to represent the burning desire within everything and everyone to manifest their destiny. So I really wanted this book to be red. And on the back, you see more red. And on the side, you see more red. And I really wanted it to have that sulfuric quality, that reddening principle of having a burning desire within one's blood to grow and become wise, which is really what this entire book is about. The cover image is an image called In the Eyes of the Beholder, and it's by an artist by the name of Joseph Barton. And I randomly found it one night when I was looking for an image for the front cover of the book because we had gone through a couple permutations. I wasn't really pleased with any of them. And then I stumbled across this guy's art, sent him an email that same night, paid him for the artwork. He sent me back the rights to the artwork. And so that's how come this is on the front and the back cover of the book. I'm not sure whether or not future publications are going to look this sort of way, but if they do, he's definitely going to be the person whose art I feature on the book. And so that's the first thing. Also, in terms of the layout of the book, well, let me just crack it open. There's like tables and diagrams and all sorts of stuff. I mean, even right down to the sort of glyphs that we use in the book, those glyphs I designed myself and I handed them over to a graphic designer because there tends to be a very standard astrology font that gets used in a lot of astrology books, particularly in a lot of the astrology books coming out today about traditional astrology or Hellenistic astrology or medieval astrology. And I didn't want to do that. I tend to be very independent and a bit of a lone wolf in most things. And I want things to always feel like me throughout their entirety. So I have poured over every font and every diagram and everything within this book to make sure that it's completely reflective of what I want it to look like. I'll show you a cool one that I'm very excited about, and I'm very excited about other people being excited about it as well. It's a rather stupid one, but all the same. Hold on, let me see if you can see that. So, can you see it?
Yeah.
So those are the angular, succedent, and cadent houses. And I just love how that looks. It looks kind of like some mystical flying saucer situation. And I just had that idea to make something like that to really represent those houses in terms of their strength and their power. And I really nerded out over this book. And I got very little help from, actually, let me rephrase that. I got absolutely no help whatsoever from anyone from an astrological perspective in terms of the layout of diagrams or anything, because I wanted it to look like me. I wanted it to feel like me. I wanted it to express me. One of the people who did help a considerable amount in terms of reviewing the book, and I'm so very grateful for him, is Anthony Lewis. He's the author of Horary Astrology, Plain and Simple, as well as Tarot, Plain and Simple. And Tony has written quite a few books, and he reviewed the entire book for me from cover to cover, and he gave me his thoughts and his opinions. And I consider Tony to be one of the most brilliant thinkers in traditional Western tropical astrology. And he's also someone who uses Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And so I'm really grateful to have had his advice and to be able to counsel with him to figure out how I could improve something, or if I said something that didn't really make a lot of sense, or if I could refine a concept. And there are many places where I completely took his advice that he gave. And there are other places where I felt like, hey, I really want for this thing to express what I'm trying to say, and this is the best way to express that. So there was a lot of dialogue around that. But at the end of the day, I'm really happy with how everything came out. And I'll show you one more thing about this. One of my favorite quotes from the Bible is, "The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord." And while that word fair oftentimes gets translated to being fear, like to be afraid of something, within the context that it's meant to be awe. And so it's meant to be this silent state of reverential awe. And that's what fair meant. And the word that's actually used within Hebrew is also a word that is meant to reflect that reverential awe. So that's one of my favorite verses in the Bible. The beginning of wisdom is the awe of the Lord, or the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And one of my favorite verses from the Corpus Hermeticum, or the writings of Hermes, is, "For nature is also rooted in God." I did a very sacrilegious thing, and I took something from the Hebrew Bible and I took something from the Corpus Hermeticum, and I got my Hebrew calligraphy teacher, Izzy Plodwinski, to create this wonderful artwork on the inner cover of the book. And so on the front cover, we see this mandala, which says, "The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord." And on the back cover, it says, "For nature is also rooted in God." And so it just feels like this book is blessed. And it really also feels like this book represents a full coming around for me in terms of my own journey with faith and religiosity and spirituality and astrology and all of the things that make me on a spiritual level. And I really can't wait to share this with the world.
Thanks so much for talking with me about the book, and I'm so excited to have it and to use it.
Thank you so much, Jack Kovaleski, and thank you so much for being willing to do this with me this evening. I'm so excited for all of the things that you are going to be doing in the world as an astrologer, and I'm going to have you back on the show to talk more about your own astrology practice.
I'd love to be back.
Thank you so much, Jack. Have a good one.
Okay, you too.
Bye.
Bye.